episode 3 of Changing of the Gods, Democracy versus Plutocracy. Today we get to explore the ongoing battle between the wealthy elite and the working class, why those cycles happen, and how there might be a way to resolve it. So let's jump in.
Do we live in a random, meaningless universe? Or is there order in the chaos?
Det er en del af en serie om astrologiske perspektiver på vores verden, og specielt med fokus på de større bevægelser og Pluto og Saturn, og netop den her særlige tid, vi lever i lige nu. Så se godt med, og forhåbentlig kan du bruge det til noget, med det alt taget i betragtning af, hvordan situationen er lige nu. Jeg glemte lige at sige, at mit navn er Allan Davies Madsen. Jeg har været amatørastrolog i omkring 25 år, og hvis der er spørgsmål og sådan noget, så må I gerne skrive eller kommentere, og så kan vi få en snak om det, fordi det er et stort emne. Changing of the Gods.
We are rocking and rolling into history, baby!
Considering the sequence of revolutionary decades that coincide with the Uranus-Pluto cycle, there's consistently a pattern of revolt. The 99% against the 1% in one form or another, experienced as profound inequality and injustice, as was evident during the French Revolution.
Well, there's no question of anyone being oppressed.
Jeg kan lige sige, at for dem, der lige er gået i gang med at se her, den her serie kommer til at tage os helt op til nutid her, og den er udgivet netop lige nu her, som as we speak, i 2022 her i det spirende forår, kan man sige, februar. Så den er med til at forklare de situationer, der foregår nu, omkring for eksempel corona og også krigen i Ukraine osv. Så hvis du gerne vil have en større forklaring, sammenhæng på de ting, og perspektiv på de ting, så følg med. Måske er astrologi noget nyt for dig, men jeg tror nu alligevel, at den har noget relevant at sige. Så prøv at kigge med.
Quite on the contrary, everything's done to relieve suffering with clothing collections, medical aid and soup kitchens.
The French Revolution toppled the deeply unjust and repressive feudal system, triggering the global decline of absolute monarchies while replacing them with republics, liberal democracies, and the rise of capitalism. Then, under the very next Uranus-Pluto conjunction, Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels wrote the Communist Manifesto, challenging capitalism and exhorting, "Workers of the world unite. You have nothing to lose but your chains." This coincided with the famous eruption of the revolutions of 1848 and 1849 throughout Europe. It was the largest wave of simultaneous revolutionary movements in European history.
Why did 50 different countries go through revolutionary upheavals in ways that were not coordinated? There was no coherent strategy. They were spontaneously erupting throughout Europe, and they didn't have the internet then.
The rise and fall of dynasties simultaneously convulsed Asia and the Middle East. This was such an overwhelming clustering of seismic events that the respected historian William McNeill commented, "These remarkable coincidences funneled so great a change in world history into the space of less than 10 years. Many historians have said This astounding brief period marked the climax of the revolutionary impulses set in motion by the French Revolution. The next Uranus-Pluto alignment at the turn of the 20th century saw a similarly dramatic resurgence of this revolutionary lineage, the Boxer Rebellion in China, and the rapid rise of revolutionary Chinese nationalist movements.
Det skal lige siges, at de her bevægelser af Pluto og de mere astrologitekniske ting, der er omkring Plutos bevægelse og Uranus bevægelse og Saturns bevægelse, de er gennemgået i de første 2 afsnit af serien. Og ja, men det er også noget, man kan spørge mig om, som dog har studeret det i 25 år.
A wave of nationalist and anti-colonial revolts in India, Turkey, Persia, and the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Comparable world-changing events span the globe during the same period. The first Russian Revolution in 1905 led to the founding of the Menshevik and Bolshevik parties under Lenin and Trotsky, and marked the beginning of modern communism. The near simultaneous founding of all the major socialist parties took place in England, the United States, Russia, and France. This was also the critical period for the emergence of both the militant women's movement and the Black Civil Rights Movement, as well as the largest populist movement in United States history. Against the backdrop of the Gilded Age of the plutocratic robber barons, a sudden wave of progressive and radical labor movements erupted across Europe and North America.
America's workers understand the gravity of the situation.
And in 1906, Gandhi's revolutionary work began in South Africa. Civil disobedience of a nonviolent kind.
What's remarkable is that he's inspired by the civil disobedience essay that was written by Henry David Thoreau under the preceding Uranus-Pluto conjunction. And then you've got Martin Luther King under the next conjunction, drawing on Gandhi and Thoreau. We've been focusing on the Uranus-Pluto cycle. That's just one cycle. There's many others. One of the most significant is when Saturn comes into a threefold alignment with Uranus and Pluto. The principle of Saturn has to do with limits, suppression, oppression, etc. But it also can be structure. It has a positive dimension, of course. Every archetype has both sides. There were only 2 times in the last century that Saturn came into an alignment with Uranus and Pluto, where Uranus and Pluto were in square, and then Saturn came into an opposition to Uranus and Pluto, what's called a T-square. It's like a period where history is simultaneously going through this eruption of the new radical change and this a kind of historical contraction. And there's a feeling like something's got to give, and something often does give, and a kind of breakdown. And those 2 times were 1929 to 33 and 2008 to 2011. And those happened to be, of course, the Great Depression and the Great Recession right across the world, global financial markets crashing.
$25 billion of personal wealth rapidly vanished. Runaway plutocracy had crashed the economy.
The walls came tumbling down on Wall Street Monday as 2 financial giants, Merrill Lynch and Lehman Brothers, buckled under the real estate and credit crises just 6 months after the collapse of Bear Stearns.
Over 2,000 banks failed in 1931. President Roosevelt temporarily closed the nation's banks, and he directed the Treasury to send them $2 billion in new currency to prop up the failing financial system.
Nearly $2 trillion tax dollars have been shoveled into the hole that Wall Street dug.
Citizens flooded the streets in anger. They were furious at bankers for collapsing the economy.
We need to begin the process of re-regulating Wall Street, bringing back Glass-Steagall, and making sure that our taxpayers will never again be put in this position.
There must be a strict supervision of all banking and credit and investment. There must be an end to speculation with other people's money.
And coming out of the Great Depression, we put 3 new regulations in place. We say, who needs regulations? They're so pokey, so old. And where do we end up? In the biggest crisis since the Great Depression.
And the first big peak in income inequality is right before the crash of 1929 that led to the Great Depression. The next big peak on the graph is right before the crash that took the economy down again in 2008 and 2009.
We can't afford just to tinker around the edges, a tax credit here, a regulation there. Our fight is for big structural change.
I found that astrology is better understood not as being concretely predictive, but rather it's archetypally predictive. It gives one a sense for the general principle, the forces at work. Saturn is going to come into conjunction with Pluto and then square to Uranus. And that's going to take place for the last part of this decade. 2018 to 2020 and to 2021.
The coronavirus pandemic is having a devastating and historic impact on the economy. The U.S. unemployment rate reached 14.7% in April. That is the highest it's been since the Great Depression.
It is now quite clear that the EU has entered the deepest economic recession in its history.
Over 40 million people are facing financial ruin in the worst economic crisis to hit the US since the Great Depression in the 1930s.
During the 1930s transit of the Great Depression, Roosevelt responded boldly by calling for the large-scale structural change characteristic of Uranus-Pluto alignments. It became known as the New Deal. During the transit of 2007 to 2020, with a call for a Green New Deal, history rhymed yet again.
Roosevelt promised a New Deal. The government would step in on the side of labor.
New York City, federal jobs for thousands at the rate of 100 a minute. In all parts of the country, the letters WPA are a symbol of progress and improvement. Many thousands of such jobs as these dot the map of the United States, giving work and hope to people who can't find jobs.
Like the New Deal of the 1930s transit, the Green New Deal called for a federal mass mobilization to create millions of living wage jobs and reduce inequality. But in this different age of climate disruption, the additional goals evolved to create structural reform to rapidly bring greenhouse gas emissions to zero, shift to 100% renewable energy, and transform transportation, industrial, and food systems.
And it requires, I think, the kind of bold initiative that FDR first initiated to meet the crisis of the Great Depression.
History isn't even just rhyming anymore. History is full-on plagiarizing at this point.
But the overall eruption of mass movements, need for change, stress on the social fabric, people that have been in some sense left out, a great sense that there'll be a kind of return of the repressed, which is very much a common theme between the 30s and the present period.
In the US, the Occupy Wall Street protest was the spark that ignited a national and global movement to hold the financial sector accountable for its actions and crimes, and break the stranglehold of corporate greed and power. The Occupy movement disrupted cities, states, and business as usual all over the world.
Another world is possible. We are unstoppable. Another world is possible.
Officers reportedly used force to kick out some of the activists, with witnesses suggesting pepper spray and tear gas were also used.
Demonstrators and police clashing in Italy as anti-austerity protests spread throughout Europe. Workers in Spain, Italy, and Portugal also held strikes.
Like the Uranus-Pluto transit that began in 1928, the transit beginning in 2007 saw another spontaneous awakening. a resurgence of mass labor movements and strikes that spiked among low-wage workers, teachers, women, and union members.
Efforts to forcibly open the strike-paralyzed port of San Francisco failed. Open warfare rages through the streets of the city. The most disgraceful scenes of disorder New York has witnessed in many years. Rioters feeling they have nothing to fear from the police.
It's set to be an unprecedented day of action across the European continent.
Here we are, the feminists, they're chanting, banging pots and pans and refusing to work for 24 hours. Organizers say it's the first nationwide women's strike in Spain's history.
300 million workers went on a two-day strike across India, bringing the country to a grinding halt. The strike was caused by 10 central trade unions against the labour policies of Prime Minister Narendra Modi. This is the largest ever strike in world history.
Protests are being held across the country today in what organizers call the largest ever mobilization of underpaid workers.
An unprecedented number of hundreds of thousands of educators went on strike across 8 states to demand not only higher wages, but more money for schools and children's education, instead of tax cuts for corporations and the wealthy.
It's being called the biggest pay raise ever in West Virginia, not just for 20,000 striking teachers, but for tens of thousands of state employees as well.
We're seeing something new where there's not been a lot of strong union activity in many years.
Everyone agrees that things need to change.
There's a shadow side to every archetypal principle, including the Promethean Uranian, which wants freedoms at any cost. And so that impulse for freedom and change, that freedom could be like, we just want free markets to be able to run roughshod over environments, over communities, over other nations, because that's going to maximize our profits. We want a free market. We don't want government regulation.
The Uranus-Pluto square beginning in 1928 coincided with the boiling point of irreconcilable tensions between vast concentrations of wealth for the few and extreme inequality for the many. The next Uranus-Pluto square that began in 2007 displayed the same archetypal dynamics, the clash of the 1% against the 99%. It's called plutocracy, rule by the wealthy. Suddenly, the notion of plutocracy pervaded the zeitgeist and the media.
President-elect Donald Trump touted his choices for his cabinet and inner circle, a team historians say is the richest in U.S. history.
In those particular positions, I just don't want a poor person. Does that make sense? Does that make sense?
50% of Trump nominees have ties to the industries they're supposed to regulate.
The biggest economic problem we have, according to the Republicans, is that the rich don't have enough.
That tax cut gave 83% of that tax cut to the top 1%, to the richest people in this country, and now the Republicans are proposing we pay for that by cutting Medicare and Social Security.
We're about to create the deepest fiscal crisis that this country has ever had. Knowingly, and why? To give money to the richest gazillionaires in this country. It may be the biggest heist in history.
We are full on lurching toward plutocracy.
In an age of plutocracy, which we are in, the central issue in this country is whether you're going to find a way to break the stranglehold on wealth and power of a few people at the top. And if you do not have a plan to do that, you by default have a plan to perpetuate that.
As we continue our look at the massive $2 trillion coronavirus relief package, the largest stimulus bill in U.S. history, with a guest who argues the country will be unrecognizable after this pandemic if big corporations walk away with trillions of dollars and no strings attached.
It's not really a $2 trillion bill, it's more like a $6 to $10 trillion bill. And all of this stuff that's happening, the handover of power to Wall Street, is happening under the really cynical guise of helping people in a pandemic.
That's the thing about this pandemic. It's been one of the greatest wealth transfers in history, and it's a wealth transfer that was mandated by the state. This
This is the first recession where big business, along of course with bigger wealth, is coming through virtually unscathed, if not going for the gold.
The collective net worth of U.S. billionaires grew by more than $1.1 trillion during the pandemic.
The really troubling fact is that this has disproportionately landed worst for Black and Latinx communities. In both health terms and in economic terms, this has been really rough for American workers.
It is not a radical idea to say that health care is a human right, not a privilege.
There are now more than 200 nonprofit news organizations all over the country and 2,000 people now working in nonprofit newsrooms all over America.
Only 4 companies now slaughter 80% of the beef. I think the pivot to more regional food systems is happening, but I think we also have to take a really hard look at antitrust policies that made this possible.
The Justice Department declaring war on Google. Prosecutors accusing Google of being a monopoly gatekeeper for the internet.
They are huge, they have market dominance, and they behave like monopolists. And that's a big part of the reason they need to be broken apart.
The saying we use now is that the system is so fixed we need to break it. Princeton University came out with a study that looked at 1,800 policy campaigns over the last 20 years and came to the conclusion that it didn't matter what people actually wanted. It doesn't matter what majorities want because policy decisions are being made by this elite. We don't live in a democracy. The structure of the U.S. Constitution currently is about placing the rights of property over the rights of people, communities, and nature. And that's no accident. They looked out on the landscape and saw an endless bounty of natural resources. And they said, how do we become a power equivalent to France or England to survive and flourish? Which meant drawing up a plan of governance to exploit as quickly as possible and efficiently as possible that bounty of natural resources that they saw. They didn't know anything about global warming, climate change, deforestation, acidification of the oceans. The idea was, how do you convert X into Y the quickest and most efficiently way possible to become a major world power on par with the other major world powers? And that was the constitutional structure that they drafted. There's a lot of people that are talking about corporate constitutional rights as some kind of error or a mistake. It's not really a mistake at all.
Hoax political operations have exploded in the 6 years since the Supreme Court's Citizens United decision, which removed limits on campaign spending by ruling that donor money is a form of free speech. Citizens United has allowed the Kochs and others to spend millions in dark money, political donations where the source is kept secret.
What you've got here is almost like a third party that is the money party.
The Citizens United decision in 2010 was not the first time that corporations were found to have rights under our Bill of Rights. In fact, the first time that the U.S. Supreme Court found that corporations have legal rights under the Constitution was in 1819 in a decision called Dartmouth. It's something that's used and wielded against us on a daily basis so that corporations can force themselves into our communities.
The wealthiest, largest corporations almost operate under a special system of law that only they have access to, because their wealth combines with that special category of rights and privileges to give them superpowers. It's actually about a corporate class.
We turn now to the felons on Wall Street.
All of these so-called too-big-to-fail banks now have been embroiled in scandals of varying degrees of extreme seriousness since 2008, for everything from bribery to money laundering to rigging LIBOR to mass fraud in the subprime mortgage markets and now the Forex markets. It's one mass crime after another.
We just had a huge meltdown. The banks ripped people off using subprime loans, speculating on the money, and then the banks got in trouble. Our response was, we have to save the banks, not the people. We let millions of Americans lose their homes while we gave the banks money that they used to give the owners and the stockholders a raise.
Young people, listen to me. Don't try to buy no home down in Washington, D.C., cause it's a bushwalk town. It's a bushwalk town.
You could think of modern America as really happening with the New Deal. You had a plutocracy. You had the Gilded Age. You had really the country being run by a handful of families, and most Americans not fully benefiting in that. They're saying capitalism is not working. It's only working for a small number of people. And Roosevelt basically said, if I want to save capital, we have to restructure capital. We have to make it more available to larger numbers of people.
Some white folks in Washington, they know just how some colored man and niggas have to see him by Lord in the Bridgewater town. It's a Bridgewater town.
Now this is during the 1930s, so you had the Solid South, who was organized almost exclusively around race. And so what they said to Roosevelt, these were Dixiecrats, they were Democrats in the South. They said, you can do this, and you need our support to do it, but you can't interfere with the racial caste system that exists in the South. And Roosevelt capitulated. So the New Deal, we call the most important thing in terms of American history in building the middle class, was built for whites. That was the South demand in order to support unions, in order to support minimum wage, in order to support Social Security, all of the things that came out of the New Deal.
I don't want to be that treaty by the Bridgewater, Lord, in the Bridgewater town. It's a Bridgewater town.
Maybe the system's not broken, maybe it's working perfectly. It's just not working perfectly for us. For a number of years, we worked to assist communities to stop all these thousands of different single-issue problems that communities face every day when a corporation wants to come in and actually take something from the community. Our defense is hardwired into the regulations that the corporations have already written before we even get on the scene. The only thing that environmental regulations regulate are environmentalists, because they make us predictable as to how we actually defend the communities. So it's no wonder that we lose as much as we do, because it's set up for us to lose. The abolitionists didn't work to set up a slavery protection agency that would simply regulate how many lashes a slave could receive in a 24-hour basis, or trying to regulate the treatment of slaves. Because when you do that, you validate slavery. You make it easier to have slavery if you're regulating the impacts of slavery. We talk about occupying spaces and occupying other things, but this is about occupying the law. Understanding that the law is not some abstract academic thing, that whatever we want within the system, if the law has the power to knock it down, then we actually have to go and change the law. We have to change the structure and how the law operates. If a state legalizes a use, a municipality, a community is prohibited from saying no to that use. And those communities began to say, well, this system isn't fair. And they asked us to help them do a new form of organizing. And that new form of organizing was really about seizing our local governments to actually break the law collectively. So we're going to go after corporate rights. And we're going to do it all under the rubric of a right of local community self-government. Then we have a constitutional right, a basic fundamental right of local self-government to make these decisions about the places where we live. And we're going to do it legislatively, we're going to do it by direct vote of the people, we're going to do it through our local government, so it's orderly kind of revolutionary change.
In 2010, the city of Pittsburgh passed the first in the nation Community Bill of Rights, which not only prohibits fracking within the city of Pittsburgh, but it also recognizes rights of the people and nature within the city to fundamental rights to water, to a healthy environment, and prohibits fracking as a fundamental violation of those rights. They then had to eliminate things like corporate rights, which can interfere and violate the rights of the people and nature. They also had to eliminate the authority of the state and federal government to override what the city itself had put into place with that Bill of Rights. We now have communities across Pennsylvania, in Ohio, in Colorado, New York, Maryland, and other places that have put in place similar bills of rights that focus on fracking and preventing fracking from coming into those communities. This town of Barnstead in New Hampshire is the first in the nation to put in place a Bill of Rights for that community that prohibits corporations from taking their water.
We need an environmental movement that's actually about transforming nature from being a thing, from being property under the system of law, into being rights-bearing.
The rights of nature is an idea that's not brand new. Back in the 1800s, once the Civil War was over, a number of abolitionists began to turn their attention to animals and nature, seeing them as oppressed. The very first rights of nature laws in the whole world were adopted in rural communities in Pennsylvania back in the mid-2000s. These are the first laws to recognize that ecosystems and natural communities have a right to exist, to thrive, to regenerate, to maintain their natural systems and functioning. Ecuador in 2008 became the first country in the world to recognize the rights of nature in its constitution, in which courts upheld and affirmed that nature, in fact, has constitutional rights to exist. In Nepal, with the Himalayan glaciers melting, they've been drafting a constitution about recognizing the rights of nature and, in fact, a right to climate. In India, we've been working with civil society groups to draft the National Ganga River Rights Act to recognize the right of the Ganges River itself to exist and to thrive and to flourish. You cannot achieve the human right to water if those water ecosystems themselves don't have the right to exist and thrive. These rights of nature laws have now begun to expand, so we have well over 36 communities across the United States which have recognized the rights of nature in binding, legally enforceable law. And so you have communities across the country now that are making structural change. They're in fact writing local constitutions, and they're beginning to come together within states to begin to drive change upward to the state level.
These different states, the people within those states who have been working, coalescing in their own communities, have now come together to propose a federal constitutional amendment.
What democracy looks like! This is what democracy looks like!
Democracy is about more than voting. Democracy is about people actually having control and decision-making authority over certain areas of their lives. I think the hope that we derive is that this is the beginning of a mass movement that hasn't been seen in this country in the last, at least 110, 120 years since the populace of the late 1800s. Massive numbers of people coming together to actually decide what their future is going to be.
In some sense, capitalism purports to be amoral, but in some of its actions it's clearly immoral. It becomes a means without an end. So I need more. I need more. I become the hungry ghost. I'm never satisfied. In fact, capitalism is predicated on dissatisfaction, institutional dissatisfaction.
Profit and power tend to take over higher values. People start seeing other people as objects, as well as animals being harvestable commodities. The higher values are no longer seen as intrinsic to the universe itself. The universe itself has lost value. It's been disenchanted. If there is nothing sacred in the universe, then everything can be appropriated for the human will to power. You're only thinking about the quarterly profit report, not about 7 generations from now. You're only thinking about immediate gain for one species and one small part of that species, the 1%.
1%, they said. 99%
That's not sharing. Just listen to that term, trickle down. So, are we all sitting here waiting for stuff to trickle down from who, for what? Crumbs off the table? What is this? What kind of adult thinking is that? I mean, it's so amazingly stupid. I don't know what else to say. We have to change our values. We can't have commerce driving the life forces of this world because commerce has no heart.
Rich people aren't any happier than they've ever been. And money isn't making people happy, and things aren't making people happy. So why are we all still living this pretend, nightmarish, completely, really homicidal dream that if we amass more, get more, become more, better than everybody else, that we're going to be happy when we know it's simply not true? And I think that dream has been exported everywhere. And that dream has contaminated people's minds and souls all across the planet. And if America were to say, guess what? We were wrong. Bad idea. Bad dream. We need a new dream. We need a new vision. That would also go around the world as well. And it would support people who instinctively know and have held on to their own cultures, held on to their own traditions, where they actually know that making and buying and striving and getting isn't the point of living at all.
Tak fordi I kiggede med. Mit navn er Allan Davies Madsen, og jeg er veteran, aktivist og kendt med i filosofi og psykologi. Filosof. Og ja, som jeg sagde før, amatør astrolog. Så jeg håber, at det her får den her video ud til mange flere mennesker. Fordi det er vigtige informationer, synes jeg. Og hvis der er nogen, der har andre indspark i den samme debat her, eller synes, der er noget, der er helt langt ude i hammen, så er selvfølgelig også velkommen til at skrive til mig, eller kommentere på videoen. Moin.